Welcome to the first in the Habitat Makers series, The Abandoned Lot Transformed. This series is in 3 parts. First, we'll look at the challenge. Next, we'll look at overcoming the challenges and mobilizing support. And lastly, we'll look at the transformation process. The abandoned lot. You've all seen them. You may have one in your neighborhood. Neglected and unloved, unbuildable for one reason or another. Municipalities don't know what to do with them. Habitat makers take a look at the abandoned lot and see an opportunity. I'm here today in Minnetonka, Minnesota with noted bee expert and author Heather Holm. Heather and a group of her neighbors have transformed an abandoned lot in their neighborhood. Welcome, Heather.
Thanks for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure, I'm a pollinator conservationist and author of 2 books on bees and pollinators, and I largely focus on native bee conservation as well as creating habitat and preserving habitat for native bee species.
How did you get the idea to take the abandoned lot in your neighborhood and restore it?
It's really about its location and visibility. I have to drive by that abandoned lot every time I leave the neighborhood or come back into the neighborhood. It was filled with invasive plant species. In our area in Minnesota, the primary plant that invades woodlands or savannas is a plant called European buckthorn. And it was so dark, and some neighbors have described it as scary and inaccessible. I got to the point where it drove me crazy. I had to do something about it. I knew that the space had potential for providing good pollinator habitat and other habitat for other species. So it was really just this opportunity that was waiting for someone to take advantage of it.
What about other areas of the country? Do they have their European buckthorns or?
Absolutely. Depending on where you live, you may be experiencing non-native honeysuckles, Japanese barberry, privet. Those are all similarly behaving invasive plant species that can really degrade our native plant communities.
Some people will look at this and they'll see green and they'll think, hey, it looks nice. It provides a screen. What's the problem with it?
That's one of the primary arguments for people who don't realize it's an invasive plant. They like it for its privacy, the fact that it holds its leaves late into the fall. But what happens when you have bullies such as this, the European buckthorn, they invade an area and they take up most of the real estate. It really reduces diversity. It drives out other native plants that are supporting birds and pollinators. It really just becomes a dead zone for habitat.
So shall we go into the thicket and see what it looks like in there?
Sure, let's do it.
That's a thicket.
That is a thicket.
So can you tell us, Heather, what's going on in the degradation process? What's happening here?
Well, you can see behind us, this is 100% invasive species. The degradation process typically starts with some sort of disturbance, and that disturbance creates an opportunity for invasive plants to move in. And once they get a foothold and start occupying real estate, that's when they start pushing out native plant species. So you can imagine what was once a thriving, robust place maybe for pollinators is now nothing.
So it's essentially a dead zone, biologically speaking.
Right.
How do the berries spread? Do they just drop to the ground, or can they travel distances by other means?
Yeah, so this particular invasive plant, European buckthorn, has separate male and female plants. The females produce these clusters of berries, and the berries either fall from the female tree to the ground to germinate, or they are dispersed by birds that consume the berries. And so even though you may see a localized population of an invasive plant, it has the capacity to be spread very quickly to other places.
Where do you begin in an area like this?
You really have to start with a plan, because many people are unaware that all I have to do is remove the invasive plant and I'm done. And that is not the case whatsoever. So you can imagine if we were to come into this site and remove all the invasive plants, what we're essentially doing is creating a whole new disturbance. And if we don't have a follow-through plan of planting the right species, We are just basically putting out the welcome mat for another kind of invasive species to come in.
If left on its own, what would happen to an area like this?
Over time, it would just continue to degrade. The buckthorn may mature, it may start to fall over, but the site has had this disturbance and this long-term history of the soil being impacted. New invasive plants may come in, but it's just going to continue to degrade in different ways.
Now, I've heard of some restorations where they bring goats in. Would that work in a thicket like this?
Goats wouldn't work in a thicket like this. They may be helpful or useful if you cut the plants and then the goats were browsing the regrowth, but they're not a be-all and end-all. They're one tool in a very large toolbox of restoration techniques. They can be very useful in certain sequencing and timing of a restoration, but they can't solve all the problems.
In episode 2, we'll be looking at the restoration that you and your neighbors did. How was that different from here? Did it look like this when you first started?
Yeah, it was even more infested with even larger and older buckthorn plants. This we can barely walk through. At the outlot, it was really difficult even to get through the growth of the plants.
Before we went into the thicket, I noticed an area with an understory growth of buckthorn, overstory of native trees. So what happens to that over time?
Well, in many situations over time, those native tree species will die out. Once they die, we're literally left with a community of plants that are all invasive. And so it's really a battle of real estates, or taking over real estate, and the invasive species win that battle.
So essentially you're left with a monoculture.
Yes, a monoculture or this new assemblage of plants that aren't functional and are primarily all invasive.
Join us in the next part of our Habitat Maker series of the Abandoned Lot Transformed. We'll take a look at what Heather and her team have done to overcome challenges and also how they mobilize support in their neighborhood to make it a reality.